Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is the program bringing you news, views, and information on religious liberty events in the US and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty Magazine, and my guest on this program is Carmela Monk Crawford. I know you mostly as Carmela Monk.
That's right.
Because it's been a long, long time since I first met you.
That's correct.
But you were doing much the same thing you're doing now.
Yes.
You were working on Message Magazine, and you were the associate way back when I first met you.
Yes.
And so let's talk a little bit about the magazine that you edit, and I think we'll bring out a certain connection to religious liberty and what Liberty Magazine does, the magazine that I edit.
Oh, yes.
Tell me about Message Magazine.
Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me. This is an honor to sit here across from you, Lincoln, and talk with you. You're right. We have known each other for a long time, and I've always admired the work that you do and respect what you do with Liberty Magazine. And so it's an honor to be here at Liberty Insider. With Message Magazine, as you have said, I did work with Message many years ago, and I left.
And you're not that old, so let's put
I was very, very young.
But let's put it into a bigger perspective, because I talk about Liberty, and it's sometimes said that it's the oldest magazine. Well, I'm not the oldest person.
Right.
Liberty's been around 110 years plus. How many years since Message was begun?
Well, it sounds almost like carbon dating that we do here, but Message Magazine has roots back to the Gospel Herald. The Gospel Herald was one of the publications that James Edson White published from his Morning Star.
Which was a special, a little boat that was a ministry to blacks down in the South, right?
That's correct. That's correct. It is a wonderful part, a wonderful story for us, because James Edson White was a white Christian, and a generation after emancipation, he decided that he needed to do something personally for people who were in the South, people who were formerly enslaved people who were in the South. And he decided that he was going to go with a ministry that was comprehensive, a ministry that would reach people. And so he had this boat made, and he got on this boat, went down the Mississippi, and from different town to different town, he did everything from preach and teach the gospel to vocational training and helping people just elevate in what was a terrible situation in this country. And so James Edson White, a Christian man, went down there, and he had two publications. One was the Gospel Herald, and the other was the Gospel Primer. The Gospel Primer would teach people how to read using Bible scripture. People still do that today. And then the other one was the Gospel Herald, in which it would talk about the work that was being done, the advancements that were being done in the communities, the needs that were there. And so Message has its roots all the way back to 1898. Yeah. So that's
it's interesting you bring out this aspect of basically Reconstruction, the Reconstruction period, because it seems to me from my study of U.S. history, that's when the real deficiency of the whole period of slavery became evident, because before then there was no particular guarantee. In fact, the default setting was that they were not educated. They were not given education or the benefits of general knowledge. So there was a crying need to educate a whole class of people. And I've thought about it recently. You know, in Myanmar, currently there's what amounts to a civil war of sorts with the Rohingya, people that came from nearby Bangladesh, but they're slightly different ethnically, and they're not even granted citizen. They're persecuted, and at the moment being killed gratuitously. But one of the worst things visited upon them is they're not given the right to education or the other benefits of being a citizen. So after a while, apart from how they're treated, they really miss out on everything that the country has to offer because of that lack of education. So this was a very practical ministry that Edson was involved with. It wasn't just preaching the gospel, which of course will save their souls, but it was practical help.
Right.
So when did this early magazine, though, morph into the title, Message?
Well, that was 1798, thereabouts, and the Gospel Herald was printed for some years, and then it was renamed after a hiatus in 1934. Message, okay. The Message magazine.
I knew they had been, because yes. Same with Liberty. Liberty began as the Sentinel and the Sentinel of Liberty, and there was a little break from the late 1880s till 1906 when Liberty began. Right. And for some of the same reasons. Yes. Our church really went through an interesting period.
Well, the church in the country, the church mirrored what was happening in the country, some of the inner struggles and priority setting. And I believe that was the case with the early Message magazine under the title The Gospel Herald. You had a lot of need there. W.E.B. Du Bois talks about the Negro problem. That was, he said, what are we doing? And so when you make the analogy and you talk about the Rohingya, you're looking at a group of people without anything. Nothing, yeah. and just nowhere to go, and so there needed to be some work done, and so people had to come to grips with where we are now and what's going to happen. Certainly, the responsibility for a whole group of people needs to be attended to, and people need to be educated and nurtured and given the resources that they need to make a living. And
it seems to me, I've read Liberty. Message. Forgive me for jumbling magazines up. I remember a friend of mine years ago, he actually sang at our wedding. He was a black Cuban tenor, and he studied of course he grew up in Cuba where there was Spanish, but he studied in Germany, knew German, and he'd been in France and knew English, of course. And I remember once when he was introducing his songs, he was slipping from one language to the other, and he says, "Forgive me, I have a soup of languages, and I have a soup of magazines." But with Message, I've read it for a long time, and it seems to me consistently and all the time I've seen it, it's dealt with a lot of social issues, and I always saw the logic of that because, as I say, on Reconstruction, it wasn't just uneducated or lack of education. It was people that were being abused in very practical ways. They were being disenfranchised of their vote. They were being disenfranchised from their land. Nothing could be worse than the period of slavery, but in some ways it was even more malign, it seems to me. Yes. The war had been won ostensibly toward the end to free a whole group of people, but yet in the South, every effort, even of the legislators and of society, was bent toward disempowering and in essence, putting them back to tenant farmers and bonded servants and so on, which is the same thing. Yes. So in my view, it was a reversion to slavery.
Yes, you have this expansion of rights and a contraction of rights, expansion of rights, a contraction of rights, expansion of representation and a contraction of representation, expansion of opportunities, contraction of opportunities. And that pattern, I'm smiling not out of, because that's a good story, but it echoes so much of what's happening today.
Absolutely. And we will talk about that. Yes. If not here, then in another program. Absolutely. We've got to. That warrants a long discussion.
Yes.
So Message was very narrowly focused on a needy group then, but you wouldn't say now Message is only for one minority group, would you?
We have never said that, and I have to, and that's probably one point of defense that I always find myself having to say. Message was never solely created by people who are not African American or were African American. Never was it intended to solely be for an African American audience. I think it is a sad commentary when the advocacy and the people who are responsible for articulating certain things is a very narrow group when there is a wide range of issues that need to be addressed by all of us.
I've had discussions with some of your predecessors,
yes.
So I know the tendencies.
You know, yes.
But no, I wanted you to say that because I think Message can fill a very needed role in looking at the less than mainstream concern, but it's a whole range of ethnic groups, a whole range of subdivisions of society, not necessarily ethnic or even religious connotations.
Correct.
But
Correct. And the human dynamic is what I guess we're trying to talk about and try to focus on, the human dynamic. What is happening in your home? What is happening with your health? What is happening with your family? These are all things that we all care about across the board, no matter who you are.
And maybe with the demise of some of our women's emphasis magazines, you could even focus on that more than some of the
yes, sadly,
the other magazines.
So. Sadly so.
No, but really, it's all part of a push toward general civil liberties in this country. I mean, the women's battle for even the vote in the U.S. is a major one that people have forgotten.
Right, right.
And of course, when I was young, the Equal Rights Amendment and so on. And I can remember in fact, the other day I saw a video of the women burning their bras. At the time, it was all crazy, but it was a symbol of trying to break free of a very real oppression. It wasn't just a moral liberalism that came out. There was repression that lay behind this.
Right, right.
And even our own church, as you know, had a huge court case.
Yes.
The Mary Kay, wasn't it?
Yes.
Mary Kay case where they went to court because she wasn't just so much she wasn't being paid as much. There was a whole a status question. In this case, the church was languishing a little behind where the law was.
Right, right. And I don't think we should be there.
No.
I think we should be out front when it comes to both recognizing and sniffing out inequality, recognizing what's being done for people who you may not readily notice or may not be in your circle. I believe we should be the leaders.
Well, what did Paul say? He says that in Christ there is now neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, and so on.
Yes.
I mean, this is a biblical injunction.
Absolutely.
Let's take a quick break. We'll be back shortly. So stay with us and we'll continue this discussion with Carmela Monk Crawford, editor of Message magazine. Welcome back to the Liberty Insider. Before the break with Carmela Monk Crawford, I was trying to have her unwrap some of the history of Message magazine. And of course, its history is a lot of the history of the United States, at least in the modern era. And that's not over, is it?
No, no, it's not.
Even since or at the time of the last election and ongoing, there's things like Black Lives Matter.
Yes.
We're having to fight the same wars for civil rights.
Yes.
In my view.
That's right.
So Message must be doing very, very well, right?
Oh, what a time it is. What a time. I was telling someone just last year, I said, as a African-American woman, I am stressed with the amount of topics and the things that are happening on a day-to-day basis, the things that are happening, the rollbacks, the voter suppression, the charges of voter fraud, the idea of harassment and sexual assault, the idea of so many different things, the health disparities, access to health care, lack of access to health care, outright issues where community policies, such as what's happened in Flint, affect people's health, which is such an egregious case where people are sickened. I was looking, I think I told you a few weeks ago, we were in a seminar, not a seminar, but it was a workshop. They were discussing some research, and they were looking at a map of Chicago, overlay of Chicago. And you've heard so much in the news about how Chicago is the murder capital, which is not true. And you've heard so much about the violence, but they do have some different issues, and a cycle of police to citizen interactions that end up badly, to say the least, and a cycle of higher incarceration rates and mass confinement rates for people of color. And we were looking at the map, and the map of Chicago is almost like I would say a boot, more like a stocking shape map. And the map talks about violence, so that's one thing.
The demographics you talk about,
demographics. And you're looking at violence, then you're looking at foreclosures, then you're looking at jobless rates, Then, after all of those things that seem to put the folks in this area at a disadvantage, you look at the same people are exposed to lead to the tune of 75 to 100% of the people have lead exposure and lead poisoning. How are people supposed to grow? How are people supposed to prosper? How are they supposed to move on when you have those kinds of things happening? And that's what happened in Flint.
It's a multifaceted, threat to people's security and even knowledge of the world as it is.
But the reason why I say that, though, is when you're open by talking about message and where we are consistently our
battle's
message.
Not over,
the battle is not only over, but the consistent thread is the impact on people of color, in particular African Americans. And so we do have a
There's
great
no
work
question.
to do.
You know, clearly, it's a little broader. Minorities, and particularly ethnic minorities, but there's minorities for other reasons. There's, the way I would put it, the underclass in America is larger than people imagine, and the underclass in America is as badly off as any underclass in the Western world.
Interesting you say that.
And the system doesn't care to deal with them.
Right now, we are at a time in our country where we're seeing the people, the incomes run away for that highest end, and people who are on the lower end is just blossoming. So I was reading a statistic, you know, of course you have the measure of the poverty level, or the poverty index, but there's another index that doesn't just address income and what people bring in, but it also looks at the income as you match it against the need for your housing, need for your clothing, need for everything just to live. And they say at least 43% of the people are dealing with that kind of income or money strain. It's a very, very interesting time. And so, like you said, it's not just African Americans.
No, but you know, they were the singular group that was systematically kept down, mistreated, and then after the Civil War and Reconstruction were picked on more than others, and they're emblematic and central to what's going on. You can't dismiss this single group, but it's not just them, and the U.S. has not an enviable record in dealing with minorities generally. No. Some minorities have moved on and up, like the Irish.
And I wouldn't consider them an Irish. They're not.
But they were not just ethnic; they were a religious minority. So when they came, they stood out with their accent, their religion in an overwhelmingly Protestant country. That Catholicism caused problems. And you know, I don't know if you know the history of the Irish. At one stage, there was a riot in New York City. It was around close to the Civil War, as I remember. But 50,000 people rampaged through the streets for about 3 days, killing any Irishman they could lay their hands on. Horrible stuff.
Right.
And for different reasons, different minorities have popped up and gathered the ire. We were talking before the program about the Chinese.
Right.
Again, horrible mistreatment. Not, I think, because they look different, but that was an easy way to pick on them. But they were seen as taking away jobs and threatening the way of life for other people, and violence and then legal restrictions followed that you can't defend in the modern era.
No, you can't defend it at any point.
We've got a little bit of time left, but you mentioned Chicago. Let's talk about Chicago. And I know I've got a few years on you. I remember very well 1968 and the Democratic National Convention and the rioting in Chicago. And lately, a few times I've seen on documentary footage recounting of that. It's quite shocking, even at this point in time, to see the police just gratuitously, hundreds of police beating young people, some of them lying insensible on the streets, others with their heads wide open and blood everywhere, dragging them like dead meat into the paddy wagons. I mean, Chicago's had an interesting history, and at that period, it was run like a mafia. Mayor Daley and his machine, it was really Tammany Hall writ large, in my view.
Right.
So, you know, Chicago's not out of the woods yet, but it's come a long way from that era, from the Al Capone and the Prohibition era and the crime and so on. So the minorities there have suffered, but I think they're suffering because it's been a very dysfunctional city for a very long time.
I think minorities, particularly African Americans, suffer because there is a long history that has not been dealt with, structurally as well as interpersonally. And you know,
well, I don't know how, and you probably don't know either. I call it the burden of history. How do you get over it? But it's real. It
is real, and until we deal with that, I have the privilege of being here with you the week after the Starbucks chairman closed 8,000 Starbucks shops across the United States. The week after Roseanne Barr writes an extremely inflammatory and insensitive racial remark. African Americans have borne the brunt of this, and African Americans have been leading the cause. And why am I saying that? Not to hold up what our experience has been, but what is relevant to me, especially in the context talking with you, I believe that the experience that African Americans have gone through and continue to go through, it puts that experience as the canary in the mine. So when we see people being beaten, when we see a lack of police rights, when we see that the police are stopping and frisking and asking, just stopping because they want to, and when we see people being disproportionately confined and jailed and incarcerated and all that sort of thing, we are seeing that continuum of rights that we all hold dear, especially church folks, where we believe in our freedom of speech and our freedom to worship, but the freedoms have been burning on this end for so long.
I watched some footage of the Democratic Convention the other day, and Walter Cronkite, long dead now, but he was an icon,
Yes, he was.
If Walter Icahn said something, it was true. And here, in the aftermath of it, he was sitting in the convention, and he looked at the camera, and he says, we are living in a police state. He says, there's no other way to describe it.
Right.
Now, nowadays, if you say that, you get shouted down, but we've already been there. And this is not the worst country in the world by any means, but it has periodically had aspects of police state.
Right.
And when you see...
And some people feel it more than others.
Right. And
so
I've dealt with, I've told you privately, in one of my previous jobs, I dealt a lot with the police forces, did videos with them on occasion. They were kind to me, but I know that they treat certain areas of certain cities sort of like a plantation. It's open season for them. And there, in their defense, there's huge problems that how would they deal with it? But when you add to it this view that it's sort of a class of people that they don't have to worry about, it's very sad. And I think we need to have a public discussion about this and make sure that it's addressed. And in my closing, and I want to have a few comments from you, but it's worth remembering, since this is a religious liberty program at root, that really the basis of our practical religious liberties day to day, in the workplace particularly, comes from the civil rights movement.
Yes.
The Constitution is a little vague, but the civil rights legislation guarantees lack of, that there'll be no prejudice against you because of your religion, your ethnicity, your gender, and so on.
Right, right. And you make such a good point. What I would like to see us to continue to explore is ways that we can be very active in the struggle, ways in which we can educate our children, educate our schools, the principals and the teachers in our schools to discuss what we need to regarding preventing problems from happening and protecting our children.
And all of these rights are interconnected, aren't they?
They are interconnected.
And so if we treat one group badly in one area, likely religious liberty will suffer.
Oh yes, I believe the freedom of speech is a major issue. I believe your practice, your ability to protest as you need to is an issue. The ability to articulate these things, this is where we are right now, and I believe that What I'm trying to do is make sure that my children know how to comport themselves, but they also know what their rights are, and they also realize that you have to do what you have to do to stand firm.
As editor of Liberty magazine, it's very gratifying for me to have as my guest on this program the editor of Message magazine, another Seventh-day Adventist magazine. And it's worth remembering and me reminding you that our movement, a movement of expectation of the soon and almost immediate return of Jesus Christ, was carried forward on the efforts of publications and the output of editors. And today, editors are important. Twitter and all the rest, yes, that's the social wave. But it's the people that are generating the thoughts and interpreting them to the larger audience that continue to make a difference. Message, yes, there's a message to give. Liberty, there is still liberation called for, as Jesus said in Nazareth, freedom for all. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.